U.S. officials now say that Iran is responsible for the recent attacks on 2 key oil facilities in Saudi Arabia. This is despite the Houthis of Yemen actually claiming responsibility for this attack, saying it's retribution for Saudi Arabia's criminal activity in the region. RT's Caleb Maupin takes a closer look at these allegations by Washington.
Now, the Trump administration says that it knows for sure who is responsible for the recent attack on Saudi Arabian oil facilities. Well, kind of. Try and decode these recent statements from the president.
Mr. President, have you seen evidence, proof that Iran was behind the attack?
Well, it's looking that way. We'll have some pretty good, we're having some very strong studies done, but it's certainly looking that way at this moment, and we'll let you know. As soon as we find out definitively, we'll let you know, but it does look that way.
And then, just half a minute later.
You said that you think that Iran is responsible for the attack. Do you think that
I didn't say that. Why do you say that? I said that we think we know who it was, but I didn't say anybody.
Just crystal clear. No ambiguity there, huh? Well, on Saturday, U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo said that he was absolutely sure of who did it within hours of the attack.
We call on all nations to publicly and unequivocally condemn Iran's attacks. The United States will work with our partners and allies to ensure that energy markets remain well supplied and Iran is held accountable for its aggression.
So on Saturday, Iran absolutely did it. A few days later, well, we'll get back to you on that. Now, isn't it a little bit disturbing that the White House knows less about the attack as time goes on, not more? But we've been here before. On April 4th, 2017, there was a chemical incident in Syria. The next day, the White House was pointing fingers.
Today's chemical attack in Syria against innocent people, including women and children, is reprehensible and cannot be ignored by the civilized world. These heinous actions by the Bashar al-Assad regime are a consequence of the past administration's weakness and irresolution.
The Syrian skyline was lit up with the fireworks of 59 cruise missiles. However, a year later, James Mattis, who was then the U.S. Secretary of Defense, says they really weren't sure who did it.
We have other reports from the battlefield from people who claim it's been used. We do not have evidence of it.
So, they had smoking gun evidence at first, but then they left it in the elevator or they dropped it in the bus. I mean, these things happen, right? Remember back in February when a humanitarian aid truck was burned on the border with Venezuela? Mike Pence, the U.S. Vice President, spoke up immediately saying who was to blame.
The tyrant in Caracas danced as his henchmen murdered civilians and burned food and medicine heading to Venezuelans. Saturday was tragic for the families of those killed and suffering Venezuelans. But it was just one more day in Venezuela's journey from tyranny to freedom. Maduro must go.
Then a video emerged telling a completely different story, and it wasn't so cut and dry.
Maduro is responsible for creating the conditions of violence. His thugs denied the entry of tons of food and medicine, while thousands of courageous volunteers sought to safeguard and deliver aid to Venezuelan families.
Remember Saddam Hussein and his weapons of mass destruction, or should I say lack thereof? Well, they went ahead and bombed Iraq anyway, but they put on a show at the UN in the hopes of convincing the audience first.
Iraq declared 8,500 liters of anthrax, but UNSCOM estimates that Saddam Hussein could have produced 25,000 liters.
Whatever happened to the good old days of evidence, investigation, and solid proof? Now the rule seems to be act first, think later, and then justify your actions afterwards with 144 characters of tough talk on Twitter. Caleb Maupin, RT, New York.
For more on this, we're joined by Scott Ritter, former chief UN weapons inspector and the author of Target Iran, The Truth About the White House's Plans for Regime Change. Thank you for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me.
Now, firstly, the Trump administration is saying that the Saudis see this as, quote, their 9/11. On top of that, we already had Mike Pompeo calling this an attack by Iran, an act of war. It seems that the U.S. administration has already arrived at the conclusion that Iran is responsible for launching these attacks before a real investigation has been undertaken. What's your take on why the haste?
Well, because the Trump administration's on its back feet in terms of its Iran policy. It doesn't have an Iran policy. President Trump withdrew from the Iran nuclear deal. They've implemented this program of maximum pressure designed to compel Iran back to the negotiating table, and it's failed abysmally. The world did not rally around the United States. They rallied around Iran. And Iran's been playing a very tough game. One of the things Iran said is, if you're going to deny us the ability to sell oil, then we're going to deny everybody the ability to sell oil. And I think what we saw that took place this weekend is Iran living up to that promise, not by attacking. Iran didn't attack. This was done by the Houthi. In my opinion, there's no doubt about this. But the Houthi are empowered by Iran. They're given certain technology by Iran, and I don't believe that the Houthi would have been given the green light to attack such a strategic facility unless Iran said this was the right thing to do. It was the 9/11 for Saudi Arabia. 50% of their oil production capacity was shut down. This could be the end of Saudi Arabia if you shut down 100% of it. There is no more Saudi Arabia, and the Saudis know it. They're scared.
And let's not forget also, you could say that they wouldn't have done this had it not been for, what many are calling a brutal Saudi-led war on the country of Yemen. So at least what the Houthis are saying is that it's retribution. Now, I want to pick your brain about something you recently tweeted. You said there's a reason people don't trust the quote-unquote mainstream media anymore. And we're hearing a lot from this mainstream corporate press that, it was Iran, the Trump administration is saying it was Iran. But think about the weapons that the U.S. or the radar detection that the U.S. has that would have had to have totally and completely failed if it is true that Iran launched this attack. Talk a little bit about that.
Well, Saudi Arabia has spent tens of billions of dollars, if not more, purchasing sophisticated surface-to-air missile air defense systems, including sophisticated radars they call the Peace Shield. They're all oriented towards Iran. The United States has a significant military presence in the Persian Gulf, including sophisticated air defense. It's all oriented towards Iran. If these attacks had come out of Iran, we would have detected them. There'd be multiple radar tracks. It seems to me that the Houthi found a seam in the Saudi air defense and came in from behind, shot their drones up going west of the target, oriented on a piece of terrain, and then came in and hit it from the north. Any military expert looks at that and says that's what's happened. And yet the media gets to parrot that it came from Iran, and nobody's asking the obvious question. If it came from Iran, where is the radar?
And you could say there are some parallels to the lead up to the war on Iraq going on here as well. But in your book, you make the point that the U.S. is purposefully escalating tensions with Iran, but also that this is a war that the U.S. is not prepared to fight. So what makes Iran different from Afghanistan, Iraq, or even Syria?
Well, Afghanistan had no sophisticated military, so that's the end of that. Iraq, was defeated in 1991 and then had a decade's worth of economic sanctions, keeping its military crippled, so it wasn't an advanced military power. And Syria has been undergoing, a multi-year internal conflict that's degraded its military capacity. It's been beefed up by Russian presence, but it's still, somewhat degraded. Iran hasn't. Iran has been building a military for the last 20 years with the sole purpose of defending itself from American-led aggression. Iran has developed weapons that are geared towards sinking American ships, striking American facilities, and destroying America's regional allies' economic base. That means their oil infrastructure. And I think what we saw this past weekend is but the initial hint of what will happen to all of the oil production capability in the Middle East if the United States attacks Iran.
What's more, there's no mutual assistance treaty between Saudi Arabia and the U.S., meaning there's no legal obligation for the U.S. to come to Saudi Arabia's aid. So it's interesting that there really doesn't even seem to be a legal rationale for coming to their aid. Scott Ritter, thank you for being with me today.
So you haven't heard that we're the ones covering the stories that you won't see covered anywhere else? In Venezuela, Kazakhstan, let's go to Hong Kong. And the media reaction to that has been crickets. How about the way we cover those stories? What the hell does that mean? Wally. That's the key word in this case, uprising. Can you believe that? Watching. This is the right thing for members of the media to do, to actually pick sides. Look, if you like what you see, subscribe.